More than 1.3 million British citizens live abroad, but what happens when entire nations suddenly say, "You're no longer welcome"? Why would countries that once welcomed Brits now slam the door shut with a loud, echoing "no entry"? In 2025, the world watched as the United Kingdom, once the empire upon which the sun never set, got an unexpected wake-up call. From diplomatic strongholds to sunny retirement havens, country after country began issuing a collective ultimatum. British citizens, pack your bags. The message wasn't hidden in bureaucracy or wrapped in diplomatic niceties. It was loud, proud, and delivered with the intensity of a long-simmering grudge finally unleashed. This isn't about isolated visa issues or bureaucratic tightening. These are official bans, mass deportations, frozen bank accounts, and revoked permits. These are nations that have decided enough is enough. From Asia to South America, leaders have stood up at their podiums, looked straight into the cameras, and declared Britain an unwelcome guest. For many, this isn't just a policy shift. It's poetic justice, a delayed clapback, and a power play wrapped in post-colonial revenge. You can feel the irony dripping from this global moment. After centuries of Britain's global dominance, during which it prided itself on deciding who could enter and who must leave, the tables have now turned, and they've turned with a theatrical flair. Countries that once endured British control or influence are now reveling in their newfound ability to return the favor. If Britain once used paperwork to control the globe, now the globe is using paperwork to control the Brit. What sparked this sudden backlash? It's a cocktail of simmering resentments, unresolved colonial history, diplomatic faux pas, and a healthy dose of political theater. In some cases, it's revenge served with an extra side of surveillance. In others, it's a warning shot, part of a new world order where old imperial giants must now follow rules set by the very people they once ruled. Turkey started off the fireworks with a sharp jab. Official bans for certain British citizens, particularly those working in media and NGOs, sent a chill through expat communities. The message wasn't subtle. This wasn't about tourism, it was about politics. Ankara didn't mince words. Britain's involvement in regional disputes, particularly with Kurdish movements, was branded as interference. And if there's one thing Turkey no longer tolerates, it's a foreign hand in its domestic chessboard. British aid workers suddenly found themselves on no-fly lists. Journalists received cryptic letters suggesting they reconsider their travel plans. Students faced bizarre rejections with no explanations. Even those lucky enough to cross the border found their movements tightly restricted. The sun-kissed days of sipping tea in Istanbul were replaced by a constant buzz of surveillance and suspicion. It was no longer about who you were, but where you were from. Then came Argentina, where diplomatic history and unresolved wars took center stage. The Falklands, long a source of national fury, once again lit the fuse. British property owners in Patagonia woke up to find their deeds suddenly invalid. Bank accounts were frozen. Residency permits vanished into thin air. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was personal. The Argentine government wrapped it up neatly. Sovereignty first, British second. Or, in their latest policy language, not at all. Tourists still trickled in, but the welcome mats had been scrubbed clean. Every new arrival had to declare their allegiance, particularly those with dual citizenship. Students, retirees, and entrepreneurs were caught in the diplomatic crossfire. Suddenly, the tango had a different rhythm. British citizens found themselves dancing around a maze of restrictions, trying to hold on to the lives they'd built, only to find the walls closing in. Pakistan, always a place of deep historic ties with the UK, delivered its own dramatic twist. The government unveiled a policy that sounded more like a thriller script than immigration reform. Background checks that rivaled spy agencies, lie detector tests for residency permits, interrogations that wouldn't look out of place in a Cold War movie, all wrapped in a new doctrine called the National Clearance Mandate. British Pakistanis, once the bridge between two worlds, suddenly became suspects in both. Many had returned to reconnect with their roots or invest in family businesses. Now, they were under surveillance. Their online posts were examined, their affiliations dissected. Even charities and student groups with British connections found themselves on restricted lists. It wasn't subtle. It was a loud, glaring demand for respect, control, and an end to what many saw as lopsided diplomacy. Iran followed with its usual flair for dramatic exits. In a move that made global headlines, the country announced a total freeze on all British visa services, no exceptions, no apologies. British diplomats scrambled for clarifications. None came. Iran cited espionage, cultural disruption, and political disrespect as the culprits. The decision had layers, some logical, others theatrical, but all intentional. The British embassy in Tehran, already a tense outpost, became a fortress. British citizens inside the country were advised to leave immediately. Those applying for work, study, or family visas were turned away without even a glance. The Iranian government didn't offer nuance. To them, Britain had crossed too many lines, and now the door was shut. Hard. This wasn't diplomacy, it was a statement. And it kept snowballing. In East Africa, Kenya implemented a policy that had shades of poetic revenge. The former British colony rolled out new visa restrictions that disproportionately affected British citizens. Business permits were halted, work visas were subjected to months of delay. Even tourist groups found themselves stuck in bureaucratic limbo. Meanwhile, Kenyan media had a field day. Talk shows debated colonial reparations, satirical cartoons depicted British businessmen being escorted out by Maasai warriors. It was a spectacle and a warning. Former British-run institutions in Nairobi suddenly found their operations scrutinized. Expats, once the faces of NGO efforts, were now labeled as potential exploiters. Social media influencers who praised Kenya's wildlife and sunsets were accused of cultural appropriation. This wasn't about who had good intentions, it was about who had power and how that power had shifted. In the Caribbean, Jamaica led a surprising charge. Known for its laid-back vibes and sun-soaked beaches, the island nation shocked everyone by introducing an equity visa review. The rules? Anyone from former colonial nations had to reapply for residency and explain, in detail, how their presence benefited Jamaica. British citizens who had retired on the island or invested in vacation homes were asked to submit lengthy justification dossiers. Many failed the review. Deportation notices followed. The news exploded across British tabloids. Headlines screamed betrayal. British pensioners cried foul. Jamaican officials remained unfazed. The Prime Minister called it a necessary cleansing of neo-colonial residue. Local activists applauded. For many in Jamaica, this wasn't about money, it was about dignity. If Britain once ruled their land, they now wanted to reclaim their narrative by deciding who stayed and who left. Back in the Middle East, Qatar, an unlikely enforcer of immigration crackdowns, joined the chorus. British sports coaches, media professionals, and hospitality workers were abruptly denied renewals. The reason? Alleged moral double standards and political hypocrisy. British media's criticism of Qatar's domestic policies, particularly around human rights, didn't sit well with officials. In response, they began quietly phasing out UK-based hires. Stadium contracts were reassigned. Visas were cancelled with no explanation. It was silent, surgical, and deeply effective. South Africa wasn't far behind. Long a complex partner to the UK, the nation launched a historical Balance Act that targeted wealth inequality among immigrants. The British, often viewed as the affluent face of expat life, found themselves under the microscope. Land ownership was restricted, investment thresholds were raised, and visas tied to property development were scrapped overnight. British developers saw multi-million-dollar deals crumble. The message? South Africa was no longer a playground for foreign wealth. Even New Zealand, a country known for its politeness, tightened the screws. In 2025, it passed a cultural respect clause specifically targeting Western immigrants. British citizens applying for permanent residency now had to complete an intensive cultural awareness program, including language exams, historical re-education modules, and mandatory community service. Failure to comply? Application denied. Those already living in New Zealand were summoned for mandatory interviews, which often led to deportation orders. The era of casual British relocation had come to an unceremonious end. Back in Europe, a shockwave came from an unexpected source. Ireland, yes, the neighbour. While the two nations have enjoyed open borders and familial ties for decades, 2025 saw a controversial bill passed through the Irish Parliament. It revoked automatic residency rights for UK citizens, citing post-Brexit complications and rising housing pressures. British citizens who had relocated to Dublin for tech jobs or university life suddenly found their legal footing slipping. Rents rose, protests sparked, British flags vanished from local pubs. As the global political theatre gets spicier, another country steps onto the stage with dramatic flair. Malaysia. A former British colony turned economic tiger, Malaysia's move in 2025 was less of a whisper and more of a cannon blast. British citizens, once seen lounging in Kuala Lumpur's expat bars or hosting yoga retreats in Langkawi, were now greeted with cold stares and firm, visa denied stamps. The official reason? Cultural integrity preservation. The real reason? A boiling pot of unresolved colonial memories, modern trade snubs, and rising nationalism. Malaysia introduced the Cultural Harmony Enforcement Protocol, which in theory aims to balance foreign influences with local values. In practice, it's a velvet rope policy that subtly and sometimes not so subtly tells Brits to stay away unless they come bearing something more valuable than sarcasm and sunburn. British NGOs were promptly audited, some accused of neo-colonial attitudes, while others were simply escorted to the airport without a goodbye party. Even language teachers weren't spared. Anyone using zebra crossing instead of pedestrian lane was suddenly on a watch list. And then came the wild card, Indonesia, a country that always kept its diplomatic poker face. But in 2025, it threw its cards on the table and banned permanent residency applications for British citizens. The move stunned many, especially retirees who had flocked to Bali for cheap villas, smoothies, and spiritual awakenings. Now, those dreams were dissolving faster than a British biscuit in hot tea. The Indonesian Home Ministry launched what it called the National Sovereignty Refresh Plan, which sounded polite but functioned like an eviction notice for thousands of British nationals. Long-time expats with businesses, families, and even adopted pets were told to legalize every inch of their lives, or prepare for deportation. And if the paperwork wasn't ironclad, goodbye rice fields, hello Heathrow. Worse still, online influencers were hit hardest. That's right, those yoga instructors and beach bloggers who built entire followings by discovering already discovered villages were now facing digital exile. Content flagged as exploitative or exoticizing local culture led to social media takedowns, and some British influencers were even banned from re-entry for posting shirtless waterfall photos. Britain didn't know whether to be offended or impressed. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, Barbados, the darling of the British Commonwealth, made waves by suspending all new work permits for UK nationals. A shocker, considering the shared cultural ties, cricket obsession, and Queen-era hangover. But, according to the Barbadian government, it was time to rebalance regional equity and give locals priority. Translation: British folks sipping rum on beachside startups would need to either become citizens or stop pretending they were local after 3 weeks. This wasn't a hostile move, Barbados claimed. It was practical. But British nationals were left scrambling. The digital nomad visa program that once welcomed them with open arms was now replaced with quotas, local sponsorship requirements, and cultural orientation courses. A Brit hoping to open a cafe now had to prove fluency in Bajan Creole. Spoiler, few succeeded. And those who did were still accused of turning beach towns into mini Brightons. Then, there's Kenya. The East African nation didn't just close a few gates, it built an entire wall of policy against British migration. In an ironic twist, the country cited environmental stress caused by expatriate overdevelopment as the reason for halting British investments in property and tourism. The Masai Mara may welcome wildlife, but not wild property speculation. Towns previously dotted with British-run eco-lodges were now flying local-only banners. The Kenyan Parliament passed the Land Protection and Indigenous Development Act, which revoked residency permits for any foreigner who didn't meet their newly introduced Community Integration Index. What's that, you ask? It included proficiency in Swahili, participation in local governance meetings, and at least one marriage proposal from a local family. Most British retirees failed at step 1, understanding what a community meeting even looks like outside of Facebook. In a bold cultural flex, Kenya also mandated that expats prove an understanding of Kenyan history and contribute to indigenous land restoration projects. Several British citizens attempted to navigate this by planting a few trees and writing emotional blog posts. The government responded by suspending their Wi-Fi and placing their names on a no re-entry list. Meanwhile, in the shadows of all this diplomatic theatre, New Zealand quietly but decisively changed its immigration stance. While not calling it a ban, New Zealand's policy updates in 2025 effectively made it near impossible for British citizens to immigrate unless they were nuclear physicists, rare tradespeople, or former All Blacks. Most Brits, sadly, qualified as none of the above. For British citizens, 2025 wasn't just a wake-up call, it was an eviction notice from the post-colonial honeymoon. Those charming accent privileges expired. That assumption of welcome? Denied. The world had spoken, and the message was clear. Adapt, apologize, or pack your bags. And as airports filled with confused expats, social media lit up with hashtags like Brexiled and Union Jackpacked, one truth remained unchanged. No matter how many places ban British immigrants, the UK will never run out of tea bags, irony, or disbelief. If you're as shocked, amused, or oddly satisfied by this international role reversal, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more bold breakdowns and unexpected global shifts. Because this world, it's only getting more unpredictable.